Good morning. It's Friday, March 28th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 539 days old. I'm Natalie Ecanow, FDD Senior Research Analyst, filling in once again for Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Guess who's poised to get nearly $2 billion worth of American arms? Our not-so-favorite major non-NATO ally, Qatar. The State Department just approved the possible sale of drones, bombs, and missiles to Qatar under the Foreign Military Sales Program. Yep, you heard that one right. The country that's financed Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and the Muslim Brotherhood is being considered for massive arms sale. Chew on that. Our guest today is Garrett Exner, an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute and the executive director of the Public Interest Fellowship, which helps political, policy, and journalism professionals elevate their careers. Garrett is deeply tapped into all things related to U.S. national defense, and not to mention, he once participated in FDD's National Security Network. Last week, he and John caught up to discuss America's approach to developments across the globe, from the Houthis in Yemen and the chaos in Syria to the growing threat of the Chinese Communist Party. So stay tuned. This fascinating conversation with Garrett is coming your way in just a few short moments. Anti-Hamas protests continue to roil Gaza. Hundreds of Palestinians have flooded the streets demanding an end to Hamas rule. After 17 months of war and 18 years under Hamas's reign, civilians in Gaza are desperate for change. Hamas swept Palestinian elections in 2006, fought a bloody civil war with its Palestinian rivals, and seized control of Gaza in 2007. But Hamas's MO is to kill Jews, not to govern a people. So the group abandoned Gaza's civilians and opted to build up its military capabilities, siphoning aid and subjecting its people to abject poverty in not 1, 2, or even 3, but 5 wars with Israel in the last 15 years. Hamas is a cancer that needs to be removed, and Gazans are finally saying it out loud. As demonstrators have told reporters this week, they simply have nothing to lose. Now, if the protests fester, Hamas will soon find itself between a rock and a hard place. Suppress the riots and risk its self-styled image as a resistance force, or relent. And as Palestinians in Gaza grow louder, guess who's grown silent? Al Jazeera. The Qatari network didn't send reporters to cover the demonstrations, despite having a crew of them on the ground in Gaza, and they're zip zero zilch on Al Jazeera's Arabic language website. When we say that Qatar is a Hamas enabler, this is what we mean. The tiny, mega-rich emirate doesn't always need to accuse Israel of war crimes or reach into its deep pockets to help a terrorist friend out. Sometimes silence is enough. And now for your headlines. Headline 1. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps unveiled another so-called missile city. For those keeping track at home, this is the third missile city that the IRGC has shown off in the last month. These underground facilities store hundreds, if not thousands of missiles and are large enough for cars to drive through. Iranian media aired footage of the latest missile metropolis in which the chief of staff of Iran's armed forces, Mohammad Bagheri, was seen touring around with the commander of the IRGC's aerospace force. These missile cities are an exercise in chest thumping for the Islamic Republic. While zooming around the underground facility, Bagheri told personnel that Iran has a strong fist and is 10 times more capable than it was last April when the regime launched a direct attack on Israel. If you're shaking in your boots right now, don't. As far as I can tell, the Islamic Republic has never been more vulnerable. Israel destroyed most of Iran's air defenses in October, the regime's proxy network is hanging on by a thread, and just this week, Iran's currency dropped to a record low of 1 million rial to the dollar. That maximum pressure is, well, maxing, as Jonathan Schanzer would say. And that's something we here at FDD like to see. Headline 2, those Houthi ballistic missile attacks keep on coming. Yesterday, the Iran-backed rebels in Yemen launched 2 ballistic missiles at Israel. Thankfully, Israeli air defenses intercepted both, but sirens still rang out across central Israel. The Houthis said they targeted Ben Gurion Airport and an unnamed military target in Yaffo, south of Tel Aviv. In bonus attack, the Houthis also said they attacked the USS Harry S. Truman. That's the American aircraft carrier that's been busy conducting operations against the Houthis over the last couple of weeks. It's also one of the Houthis' latest obsessions. The rebels have claimed multiple attacks against the Truman this month, but haven't provided evidence to substantiate their claims. And headline 3, the U.S. Justice Department filed a civil complaint for the forfeiture of $47 million in proceeds from the sale of Iranian oil. According to the complaint, between 2022 and 2024, a scheme was afoot involving the shipment, storage, and sale of nearly 1 million barrels of Iranian oil. The scheme's facilitators masqueraded the oil as Malaysian in origin, including by manipulating the tanker's automatic identification system and presenting falsified documents to facilities in Croatia where the oil was stored. The storage fees were paid in US dollars. Those transactions went through financial institutions that would have denied their services had they known that the transactions were associated with Iranian oil. This whole scheme was designed to benefit the IRGC and the IRGC Quds Force, two designated terrorist organizations that use oil proceeds to fund their operations. The civil forfeiture complaint is only an allegation, but if the Justice Department is successful, millions of dollars could flow to the U.S. victims of state-sponsored terrorism fund. And with that, it's time to play John's interview with Garrett Exner. Garrett served in the Marine Corps as a Special Operations Officer, deploying across the Middle East, North and East Africa, and the South Pacific. He's also spent time on the Hill and is a U.S. national defense guru with plenty to say about America's role in the world and its approach to adversaries. So have a listen to that conversation right now.
Welcome to the program, Garrett Exner.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
All right. Well, in addition to your work at the Hudson Institute, I understand you've been working for a nonprofit called Veterans on Duty. Tell us a little bit about that.
Veterans on Duty is really a grassroots organization that's looking to ensure that we have a strong and focused military. While our adversaries are trying to attack the United States military, there's also kind of activist agenda within the United States that seeks to kind of ruin some of the aspects of the military that get it focused on lethality, on strength, on a forward presence. So we're trying to counter both sides here.
That's great. So really just trying to make sure that you go back to basics almost with the military, as opposed to some of the mission creep that we've seen over the years. It's nice to see that grassroots effort, and glad to hear that you're part of it. All right, so let's dive into some of what we're watching in Pentagon world and DoD world. One issue that I've been watching in particular is this potential shift to a China-focused strategy. And inherent to that is, I think, a notion that we're going to draw down in other places. Notably, we may draw down a bit in the Middle East as we begin to shift our focus further afield. What is your sense of what's going on, and what should we be watching? What should we be trying to prevent?
Yeah, well, I think there's kind of near universal agreement that we need to address the threat that a communist China poses to the Indo-Pacific and to the world broadly. There's also kind of universal agreement that we're not exactly prepared to counter China. So how do we husband the resources? Do we pull them from other areas or not? That's where the debate is really focused around. We need kind of right of center politics in America. I often say that there's probably a third way here, that you don't need to you don't need to do the Obama era pivot to China. You don't need to turn your back on one region to focus on the other. You can just make things more efficient in the way that we affect our policy in areas like the Middle East or Europe, but particularly for the Middle East, we're really focused on counterterrorism, on countering Iranian proxies. And you can do that in a more efficient way than we've done in the past. DoD knows how to do this, and if we just gave them the authorities to do it, we could get it done.
So, okay. One of the things is platforms, right? The kinds of weapons that we use. Is there a way to be more efficient about the weapons that we need to stock up on versus the ones that need to be deployed for our allies fighting abroad, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Israel, or perhaps even giving Taiwan what it needs? Can we walk and chew gum here?
We absolutely can. That's kind of the right mindset to have in this, is that most of what we need to have in the Pacific theater are kind of big ticket items. And actually what works well in the Middle East, although we're moving 3 carriers in there to deal with the Houthis right now, the way that I pose this for those who don't have a kind of military background or a CT background is really posing the question of why do we think that Iran uses proxies, right? And it's really for 3 reasons. It's efficient. It's lowering their risk, although we all know that Iran funds and promotes these proxies and trains them and equips them. They're trying to remove themselves a little bit from the process. And it's effective. So it's cost effective. It removes the risk for them, and it's cheaper. So, and effective at getting what they want done. America has the ability to do the same thing. We did it in the 80s, and we actually did it very effectively in countering ISIS at different points. There was some indecision that crept into there. There's a great book called Degrade and Destroy by Michael Gordon talking about the fight against ISIS. But we know how to do exactly what Iran has been doing to Israel, what Iran has been doing to us, and we can do it very effectively for those same three reasons, and it actually allows us to move those resources, those big ticket items out of the way. The big question that you have in the Middle East is authorities and the access of our SOF, of U.S. SOF, to get this done on our behalf.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about the SOF, the Special Forces. There is a debate right now about removing them from Syria in particular. We've got a new regime. They just took over, conquered the Assad regime. It's HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They're al-Qaeda at the end of the day, right? Formerly Nusra Front. And right as they move in, and this is Turkish-backed, but there's chaos all over Syria, we're talking about removing these forces. Good idea or bad idea?
I think it's a bad idea. Look, you always want to have eyes on the target, right? And terrorists are, in all these scenarios, terrorists are the target. We're not going to get, some windfall of resources by pulling a couple hundred troops out of Syria. We actually make the world a far less safer place by removing our eyes on what happens there. We learned this lesson in the 90s with Afghanistan. You want to keep eyes on what's going on. That doesn't mean we need to pour in resources. It doesn't even mean we need to get in the process of state building or nation building. The example that I use most of the time is in Somalia. For the cost of about 200 or less SOF and support in Somalia and about $25 million a year, you've taken one of the largest terrorist networks off the map in terms of their ability to attack Western allies and interests around the area. The last time we've had an attack outside of Somalia is the Westgate Mall, and I think around 2014 or 2015. So for a decade, that small investment has kept a terrorist network completely contained. And we don't really need to care if there's a stable government in Somalia. The same thing can take place in Syria. The same thing can take place in Yemen or in Lebanon. It's a small investment, and it gives us the ability to shift those larger end items over to the Pacific.
All right, so let me ask you then. I mean, I think you make a compelling argument. So why do people want to remove these forces? What's the rationale?
Well, I think the idea is that we're out there being the world's police, right? That, quote unquote, world's police, or this is part of another phrase I don't tend to like, the endless wars, right? The endless wars in the Middle East. That's not exactly what's happening. The American U.S. SOF are out there doing the business of keeping those who would seek to harm our citizens and our interests and our allies, keeping them away from the things that we care about. That's a small investment. It's why we have SOF, to give us the ability to operate in a gray zone like northern Syria. It also gives us the ability to partner with allies who would be closer to us. And it doesn't mean it needs to be a state actor. It could be the Kurds. It could be someone else. And to understand what's happening. As these, you mentioned earlier, the ruling party now in Syria was an al-Nusra Front that came from al-Qaeda. These terrorist networks are constantly shifting, and we need to have eyes on them. That you're not going to get that from a drone. It only comes from human intelligence on the ground. It doesn't need to be a big investment. It's actually relatively small. And like I said before, it's really effective.
All right, so let's keep with this theme. There were a number of people not too long ago, different folks that are now in the Trump administration, questioning U.S. naval presence in the Red Sea, right? And it was sort of a question of why we would need to spend those resources, or why we would have them in this particular theater when there were other threats that we faced elsewhere. Now, of course, we're watching the Trump administration order strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. That would seem to negate the concerns that were previously voiced by some of these people that are now in the administration. What's going on here?
So, this is a different issue than just killing terrorists in, say, Syria or Somalia. The Houthis represent a threat to free commerce of the seas, which is something that we have in Western civilization have relied on for the last 200 to 300 years. The British provided this, and now we've taken over that mantle. Free commerce of the seas is a great aspect of a free market society, that we get goods for cheaper. And you have pirates. I go back and forth on whether or not to call the Houthis terrorists or pirates. They're probably both. And they're engaging in attacking merchant vessels as they go through. 134 attacks on U.S. vessels is the number that I'm tracking right now. And killing terrorists and attacking pirates is popular. So I think President Trump knows exactly where he needs to be on this, even if some of the policy advisors that may have staffed out certain elements of the Pentagon have a different view. America needs to continue to provide free commerce of the seas. And President Trump gets that aspect. He's a businessman. He knows it. And he was right to go after this terrorist or pirate organization that's in Yemen.
Yeah, and we're going to hope, of course, to see the further degradation of this terrorist group. I can't help but note that some of the positives of such a campaign would probably lead to benefit for Europe at the end of the day. The number of vessels traversing the Red Sea, this has actually increased the cost of goods because they've been forced to divert around Africa rather than going through the Red Sea. So that means that the cost of shipping has gone up. This is for the European benefit primarily, and that seems to be a deviation of sorts from maybe our policy up until now, which is, hey, Europeans, you do you, we're out of here, we're not helping you. But actually, it does look like this policy would help with them. But let me pivot to EUCOM. Speaking of Europe and Africa, AFRICOM. These are the two commands dealing with both of these jurisdictions. We're hearing right now that we could see the subordination of AFRICOM under EUCOM. What does that actually mean in practice? Is this important?
I don't think it's as important as we might start to get ourselves worked up on. Senator Wicker put out a statement yesterday that he would like to see a wholesale review of what are called the combatant commands. So, Indo-PACOM, the Pacific Command, AFRICOM, Central Command, which is the Middle East, EUCOM, and SouthCom, to go over all of these and say, what makes sense. These are vestiges of an act from the 80s, Goldwater Nichols Act, that restructured how we set up and how we effectively put our military forward into different areas. It's relatively new in the course of American military history, and there are many people that say we need to get back to having an Eastern theater and a Western theater, an Atlantic theater and a Pacific theater, and kind of streamline the process for getting things done. AFRICOM being subordinated under EUCOM is actually going back to how it was before AFRICOM was first stood up. AFRICOM was first stood up and it was put under EUCOM for a period of time. So I think the Trump administration is working in the constraints that they're provided. But right now, it could make sense, and I could see the world in which reducing the way that we've structured our combatant commands, saying Central Command, which is in Tampa, by the way, or AFRICOM, which is in Stuttgart, is going to be subordinated under other commands and make it a more streamlined process for approval for strikes. These are all 4-star general commands, meaning the highest level that you can be as a general officer. And if we can reduce some of those down to 2 or 3-star general officer, this would actually be a good move in kind of reducing the general officer corps, which is exorbitantly high right now.
I do get a sense, though. I mean, I certainly understand the need to make the bureaucracy smaller. Mm-hmm. I do have to wonder, though, the amount of attention that will be at some point placed on Africa, given the resources, the rare earth minerals, and some of the outposts that have been built by the Chinese, by the Russians. You get a sense that the need to engage in Africa will grow. And I do wonder whether some of these efforts are a bit of spinning our wheels, but I guess we'll find out soon enough. Look, last question for you, just a question of CT operations in general. That I think in general, we can say that they're pretty effective at reducing or neutralizing terrorist networks. Southern Somalia, for example, we've seen a lot of good work done in containing al-Shabaab. But I guess what's the future here of this strategy if we're maybe reducing some of these capabilities over the long haul?
I would hate to see a reduction in U.S. SOF. Actually, the Biden administration moved forward with significant cuts to SOF and combat capabilities. I think it was misguided. I think SOF needs to become more robust, particularly if you're worried about amounts of resources. SOF punches above its weight. So rolling back some of the restraints and constraints that have been placed on SOF in the last administration that were there in the Obama administration as well. President Trump has moved forward with rolling back some of those things, with granting larger authorities and allowing SOF to get out there and kill terrorists at a faster rate, which is exactly what he did in 2017. I would like to see a larger SOF presence, a more robust SOF, and a more capable and lethal SOF, to include Marines, SEALs, Green Berets, PJs, and Rangers. There's a lot you can get done. And that frees up big ticket items. It frees up big Army and big Navy to get after the threat that China poses in the Pacific. If you just lean on SOF to do some of these smaller tasks a little bit more.
Yeah, nimble, small, flexible. These are all things that I think we're going to need moving forward. All right, we're going to leave it there. Garrett Exner, thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleagues Annie Fixler and Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery, who lead FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, published a monograph yesterday examining the state of this country's critical transportation infrastructure. Whether by plane, train, or automobile, moving troops and equipment is critical for projecting American power. Annie and Mark warned that the cybersecurity of our air, rail, and maritime infrastructure isn't up to snuff, and they have lots of smart ideas for how to fix that. The Morning Brief's very own Jonathan Schanzer, an FDD resident Turkey expert seen on GD, published a piece in The Hill with a recommendation for Donald Trump. Don't readmit Turkey to the F-35 fighter jet program, at least not yet. Turkey was booted from the program in 2019 after acquiring Russian air defenses. Now, Ankara wants back in. Sinan and John argue that the barrier for entry needs to be high. Turkey is still cozy with Russia, routinely terrorizes the Eastern Mediterranean, and remains a patron of Hamas. All that needs to change before our worst NATO ally is rewarded with some of the best American technology. And finally, FDD research analysts Ahmad Sharawi and Bridget Toomey are out with a new policy brief exposing Oman's true colors. Oman is often portrayed as the Switzerland of the Middle East, but Ahmad and Bridget tell us that's far from true. Oman is a safe haven for Houthi officials and a key supply route for the Iran-backed rebels over in Yemen. Something's gotta give. Ahmad and Bridget think Washington should pressure Oman to crack down on the Houthis under the threat of U.S. sanctions. Sounds like a plan to me. And that'll just about do it for today, folks. If your brain is craving more, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please consider supporting our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Our donors make our work possible, and we couldn't be more grateful. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Things are moving fast these days in the Middle East, so I'm sure there will be plenty to debrief with you after the weekend. Until then, adios. I'm Natalie Ecanow, signing off for FDD.